All right, let's get started. Welcome to Exile and Bookville's Authors on Tap reading series. I am Javier Ramirez, and along with Kristen Gilbert, we run Exile and Bookville, which is now a physical bookstore behind me. That's not a backdrop. That's for real. And we are so happy tonight. You guys are all in for a treat. We are excited to host our second Charco Press author, Brenda Lozano, author of Loop, who will be in conversation with Maryse Meijer. Let's meet them both and not waste any time on my chatting away. Born in Mexico City in 1981, Brenda Lozano is a fiction writer, essayist, and editor. She studied literature in Mexico and the United States, edits literary journal Make in Chicago, and is part of Ugly Duckling Press in New York. In addition to Loop, she has published her debut novel, Todo, which is currently being adapted for the screen, a book of short stories, Cómo piensan, piedras, and her most recent novel, Brujas. In 2015, she was recognized by Conaculta and the British Council as one of the most important emerging authors coming out of Mexico. And in 2017, she was chosen by the Hay Festival as part of the Bogotá 39, a list of the most outstanding Latin American authors under the age of 40. Loop is her first book to be published in English. Maryse Meijer is the author of Heartbreaker, Rag, Northwood, and her most recent, The Seventh Mansion. She lives in Chicago, and although I admire Maryse's short and sweet bio, it hardly gives any indication as to how important she is as a writer and human being. We're lucky to have her here in Chicago. We have copies of both books for purchase in store, because we can do that now. But you want to email us or call us, we'll be happy to send copies to you all over the United States. So please give us a call or come by and pick up some copies. Those of you who are smart enough, and we thank you for tuning in tonight, tonight's event, I encourage you to leave your cameras on, but please keep yourselves muted until the Q&A portion of the event. Maryse will be happy to field your questions in the chat and get them to Brenda as the night goes on. I'm going to pass this along to Maryse now. So everyone enjoy the show. And thank you guys both for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Javier. It is such an honor and a pleasure for me to be with Brenda tonight to talk about one of my favorite books from the lockdown, Loop. This beautiful, beautiful book from one of my favorite presses, Charco Press. If anybody here is new to Charco, please just save yourself some time and buy the entire series, which I think you can do online or through Exile. Because Carolina Orloff is just putting out the best of the best books right now from Latin America, and everything that I've read from them is spectacular, with this being the crown jewel in the collection. So Brenda, thank you so much for being here with me. And I usually prepare for events by taking a lot of notes and then obsessively trying to organize them 2 hours before the event and then taping them to my computer and then really stressed out about covering everything and building a thread through the event that will delight and amaze everybody in the audience. But as I was preparing for tonight and reading the book, I thought, what better way to honor this novel than to not do that and to instead maybe work through the notebook of my notes in this book with the help of the audience by asking people throughout the event to just type in a number in the chat, any number between because I literally have notes on every page, so it will work no matter what. Anything between 1 and 184, and I'll use the sort of the tarot. So maybe let's pick a card and we'll start off with questions.
I love this.
Because for those of you who haven't read the book, let me explain a little bit what it's about. It's about a narrator, a woman who is waiting for her boyfriend to return home to her from a trip to stay with his family after the death of his mother. And the book is plotless. It doesn't have a traditional arc. It's really about waiting and about thinking and about writing in a lot of ways. And there's so much in here about notebooks and about scale and about smallness and a continual reminder from the narrator to the self that the act of waiting and the act of writing to no purpose except to think about the self and to think about one's own life is sort of the work of living. That's my take. I'm not sure, Brenda, if you want to talk more about what you think the book is about and anything you want us to know about it before we start with questions.
I think I'm very lucky to be here with you right now. I would really love to be in person there, because then we could have some beers and celebrate our dear friend Catherine, who won the Young Lions Award today, and she I would love to be there right now. And well, I'm very lucky to be here with you. You're the most generous. I love this number and all your notes. I love your the spirit of the notebook in your book with all those post-its. And well, I'm very happy to be here, to be honest. And I'm very grateful also with Javier and with Christine to have us here tonight. And I think you told the story better than I did, actually. So, so I perhaps, well, I published that book, I guess it was 2015 or 14. I think it was 14. I don't remember right now, sorry. But well, it's been a couple of years since then. But still, one of the questions that I had very present when I was reading, writing and reading the things that I was reading while writing is precisely like questioning that arc that you mentioned, no? Like, I come from a very, well, we all come from a very masculine tradition, no? And telling storytelling has a lot to do with even what Aristoteles said, no? Like, there's a beginning, there's a climax, and there's the ending, no? And there's a letter that Franz Kafka sent to his best friend, Max Brod, that I think summarizes very well, like that spirit of the storytelling, which is, it's a letter where he said something like, "My dear friend, I just discovered that finishing a short story or a novel is like a massive ejaculation." So I think there's something very masculine in that structure, and I was also like questioning myself, like, why should books or stories have to follow this plot structure or something? So I was exploring that, those questions. So yeah, I think now I would question that from the very inside of the plot. But I remembered now that you said that, I thought about this question. I was thinking of, like, why should stories have those, third person, that I think it's also, I love that talking about third person, and especially like what happened with the third person in the 19th century, and like the idea of telling a story from that point of view that controls everything and that exactly tells the characters when to talk or when to speak or when to have a dialogue or so like I think part of writing today is also questioning, like, where do we come from, no? And which stories like yeah, the stories also that where we come from, no? Like all the epic Latin American books, the boom from the 70s, like all the famous writers from Latin America were basically writing those super epic stories in third person with a beginning, a climax, of course, and a big ending, no? So I think there's a lot to question about those epic stories, about those plot, or the idea we have about a plot and, well, everything. Yeah, sorry if sometimes I take longer, or, you know, if I lose myself. I do that also in Spanish. You know, I'm a Gemini, so sorry, I go here and there.
I do
Sorry about that.
And I'm a Gemini in real life. I have a twin, so our way of
Oh.
communicating is just like this, where it's like you know, get sunk into an idea and then follow all these different threads. And you know, that's one of the, everything that you were saying is just like resonates so much with my own experience as a reader and as a writer and being in school. And I remember, like, I mean, all of us probably remember this in 10th grade, where, you know, your teacher goes to the chalkboard and draws the like narrative arc, and, you know, there's like the climax and the resolution and the conflict and the hero's journey, and it's always a hero, of course, it's always a man. And then and there is somebody famous, and if anybody remembers who it was, put it in the chat, or Brenda, you know, but I think there was a woman who said something about like questioning the whole ejaculatory nature of the of this arc, and then saying, well, if it was like based on the female orgasm, like it would be like this, because we can, you know, we don't have to stop there. We can keep going.
I love that.
And I think, I mean, another part of like this whole thing about, you know, women's literature versus men, you know, male literature, and of course we're using those terms really broadly, and they don't, you know, do as much work as they think they do. But in general, thinking about how, like when Virginia Woolf was writing and her books being so oceanic, like, you know, the waves, and just the idea that like the story is in the details, the story is already in the life. And if women don't have access to like the grand narratives, or if they're writing in the small hours in between their duties, you know, for husbands and for children and for the home, that, you know, women's writing has been carved out of this, all these pressures of patriarchy, and that we are in the cracks, we are in the margins, and we're writing from that place. And in Loop, there's this emphasis on notebooks. The narrator's like in search of the perfect notebook, the ideal notebook, which I'm curious is a real notebook or not. But I liked that there was so much emphasis on this idea of the notebook rather than the manuscript. So the book itself is being a notebook as not practice for writing a novel or not practice for writing a story, but that the notebook is the book. the practice or the diaristic nature of it is the thing itself. It's not on its way to becoming some other final product. Does that make sense? And that's one of the things that really excited me about it. And then as a reader, putting my own notes in it. And you even say at some point, which made me squeal out loud today, as I was like putting some Post-its in, that, and I wish I had marked which page it was, but where you talked about like the narrator's history of writing inside the margins of books, and like how writing and reading, you know, it's all about the margins in this process. But anyway, I wondered if you had something to say about this idea of the notebook being sacred and singular in a way that I think is overlooked when we talk about writing and as a finished product.
I love this idea. Thank you for sharing it with me. It makes me think a lot.
It's your idea. My idea.
But you're developing it. You're saying it in much a better way that I wrote it. The plot, everything you've said, I think it's better than how I did it. So yeah, well, actually, I think it's a question about perhaps capitalism, no? And the days that we live in today, like it's expected that we finish something, and it's a product or a result. It's expected of what we're doing, whatever we do. So it also, of course, happens in the arts, no? Like, what is the result of all this, you know, questions you have, and all your search and your whatever, your procrastination and all the things that compose. I once read a tweet that made me laugh a lot. Like, the best part of the writing process is when I clean the dishes, you know, like that's also part of the process. And there's something that of you know, capitalism, that it's against that, and it's not about the process, but it's more about the product or the result or the piece or whatever. So I was thinking about that too, like so what if the result is the process? And while I was writing it, I was thinking a lot about, you know, just try to having a good time doing it, and like more like walking, you know, like when you have more time to you know, see the tree next to you, or you know, the new house of, you know, someone moved in the neighborhood or whatever, and you're sort of, you know, a creepy seeing what's happening and what's going on there. And I don't know, like there's something in the process that I find very interesting. Actually, well, the cover in the Spanish edition had a piece, or has a piece of a Mexican artist that I love his work. His name is Abraham Cruz Villegas, and he did some spectacular, amazing. I love those paintings. So this great artist bought a broom, you know, and a bucket of black paint, and he basically did this amazing paintings of monkeys, chimpanzees, orangutans, you know, apes, like different kinds of apes. And it was more about the process. Like you could see the broom. I don't know how to explain this, but it's at the end, it's very cheap, no? Like the materials you need. And because we work with words, there's also a lot about the process in it. And also, secondly, perhaps the notion of present in language, it's already artificial, no? Because as the beautiful Wisława Szymborska poem says, sorry, because I read it in Spanish and I'm now trying to translate it. It's a very short poem called like about past, present, and future. And she says like, when I'm pronouncing the word present, it is already past, no? Like it is already a past. So there's something in telling a story in present tense that I also found very important in that specific particular moment, no? Like this is artificial already. It already passed, but the illusion of writing in present, I found that like amazing, no? Like the whole Bible is in past tense. So all these like big stories, of course, are told in past tense, no? So questioning also like, from which perspective, who's telling the story, why do you have to do this arc, and all those questions, you know? I was just like having fun with all those color balloons, like all these questions I had, like, ooh.
And it is really, the book is very joyous, and it's full of joy in its own thinking and its own process. And also I loved that it was a book partly about love of one's friends. And you mentioned this great book.
Yeah, oh my God. Oh, have you read that beauty?
It's so good. And I I mean, just the idea of, yeah, telling a story through one's relationships with people with such affection and even when you talk about, I mean, talking about Mexico and the corruption and the violence, it's all rooted in affection, I guess is the word, you know, which is love too, but affection that has like another resonance to me of like, I don't know, of tenderness, I guess. And the book has so much tenderness in it. And there was one quote that I did mark, especially if I can find it.
Sorry.
I wrote,
close the window. Sorry, it started to rain.
The rain is welcome too.
Yeah.
Oh wait, no, I wrote end with this. Maybe I shouldn't read it. Why did I put this? Okay. Well, I'm here now, so I'm gonna go against my own plan and read it now. This evening I went for a walk in the park. Near the paved area, I saw two girls holding hands, two sisters in different school uniforms. When I passed close to them, I realized one was blind. The younger girl, who was around 7, was leading her by the hand and describing what she saw: the trees, the dried up fountain, a dog running along. And what do you think the doggy's called? Her older sister asked. Oh, he's called Doggy, of course, the younger girl answered. A girl who sees the world through what her younger sister tells her. This is love, I thought, pure and simple. It's gonna make me cry. Isn't the voice at the end of the day made for people to hear it? And aren't stories what create bonds? Isn't trying to describe what the other person can't see an act of love? Oh, so good. I mean, it's personal for me because as a twin, I always talk about how I'm only a writer because I have a sister to tell stories to and a sister to tell stories with. And so much of our life is telling stories to each other. And that's the real work of my life, not with the books that I write, but the stories that I tell with my sister, which are not published. But I mean, to me, like, that's just like the core of what the feeling of reading this book is like. It's like an homage to not what the product is, but what the process of storytelling, which is in the present tense, which is even when we're reading, the story becomes present again, and the reader is there in the moment with the book and with the writer and with all the other people who've read it and all the influences that went into making the book, and that it is a communal endeavor. And what's missing from the Western tradition of talking about literature and about criticism is thinking that it's singular in both authorship and in time, and that there's like it's fixed, like the thing was made and then it exists, and there's only some people who can talk about it with authority, and there's right ways to talk about it, and it's just frozen in time, which we know as like living in the world that's not how we experience anything, and yet the way books are taught and often in the way that we talk about them and think about them is as if they're dead, and that the stories are not always being told and heard all the time in the present moment. And I don't know where I'm going with that, but I just love that. I just love that portion of the book, and how to me that's like the heart of it. This idea.
It's very sweet what you're saying, and thank you for also sharing that relationship with your sister, your twin sister, and the stories you tell her. And well, I think well, when I was writing it, I remember of thinking like, why should I was questioning myself, like if I should name the protagonist, the narrator also. And at the end, I decided not to name her, not to give her a name, but to give name to all the like people we love or have close to us or something, are also mirrors, like different kinds of mirrors, no? Like almost in the, what's the name? I don't know. You know, what's the name of those? I'm sure you went to one of them, perhaps. like those crazy houses, like fun houses, or where they have mirrors, like bended mirrors, and like
like carnival mirrors. Yeah,
exactly. So if you reflect yourself in one of those, perhaps you see a silly part of yourself, or a funny side or whatever. And if you see yourself in a regular Walmart mirror or whatever, you see yourself. So I think there's something of mirroring in naming. Like we are mostly, I would say, what we, sorry, it sounds so so stupid or something, but doesn't we're also what we are not. So and we are not our friends, but we are also them, because we mirror in them, no? So it's like a prisma, or we have more dimensions to ourselves than our body, no?
Yeah.
Oh, deciros, porfa. Sorry. My brother's dog just came in, so I was trying not to close the door.
You have the rain, you have the dog, you have all of these elements that are insisting that they're also part of this narrative, not just the people.
But well, yeah, about names and bonds and everything, I think that the people we have close, or our closest friends, or even not so closest friends, like friends, or even they also, it would be very selfish, I would say, and of course a very capitalistic and white, I would say, also point of view, like to think that we are only by ourselves, no? Or that our identity has also to do with what we are, like if everything starts and ends with us, that's the contrary of community, the contrary, of course, of feminism, and many other things, no? So yeah, I absolutely think that there's something, there's like an extension or something of a character or a person with other characters. So I thought it was like a good idea to not to name her, but of course to name all her friends, and like name everything around her except her point of view. She's the one at the end telling the story. So I think nowadays I wouldn't make that decision, but that was the reasoning when I was doing it.
Why would you change it now if you would write the book?
because from when I was writing the book, of course, Mexico is a very violent country, and it is a very violent, especially against women. So I think it is important now to name us, and to name us specifically in a very violent context against us, that mainly erases names, erases female figures, our work, or so I would say I would take a different decision. But if I would do that book again, I would not name her, because that was what I was looking for, like a character to reflect also in the other characters. But well, how do you name characters? Please tell me a bit about that. Like, what are your questions when you name a character? Do you randomly choose their names?
I have a hard time with this, and I often don't name characters. And I just it's so interesting you're talking about like naming women, because I just finished another collection of stories, and it's mostly male characters, but the women in two of them are unnamed. And my agent had a problem with that, because she was like, oh, but they're both the stories are about the men that they're relating to. And of course the men are named, and she just thought for the same reasons that you thought it was problematic. And I had to struggle with that question of like, I feel like, you know, maybe the not naming, if people notice it, then they'll think of the question themselves. You know what I mean? Like, why is she named by the nickname or the moniker, you know, that the man gives her, but her real name isn't revealed. But the other part of it is that I have a horrible time naming people. Like if the name doesn't appear to me immediately, then it's like the person just is doomed to be nameless because I'm lazy. So, but you're right that like names are really important, and if who is named in the text, of course, is really important too. But and who is erased, you know, in that namelessness. But this idea of like, and you talk about the kaleidoscope in the book, and with the narrator not having the name, being, you know, that she's herself, but she's also the sum of all of these other relationships and connections. As my brother-in-law is on here tonight, Peter Stevenson, he's a philosopher, and one of the great contributions to my way of thinking in the world is his articulation of the communal persona, which is that an individual is not, as you say, like it's against this liberal notion of everyone being isolated and alone, but rather that people are the points where we interconnect with other beings, whether they're people or animals or facets.
Exactly.
And it's at the point of the intersection that the being can even be possible. And this whole Western philosophy notion that like man is born alone, as if his mother's not there, as if somehow this is the only time where the guy will forget that there's a vagina in the room. But like, he only forgets it when it's like gave birth to him, and then that you die alone, and like you're even not even sure in so much of philosophy that other people exist, as if it's some great mystery and you have to prove that you're not the only consciousness walking the earth. And again, not to harp on being a twin, but I think when you're born knowing that you used to be the same thing as someone else, it's impossible to have that notion of like
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't even make sense. It's like, to me, it's obvious that that's not even possible, that we wouldn't live without you know, this intersection. But I should allow the intersection to flourish in our talk by doing what I said we'd do. And yeah, the first
I feel I need a twin.
I mean,
do you accept like a triplet? Like, can I be your triplet?
I don't want to brag, but being a twin is pretty great. It's the best accessory a human could have. Another one of you. All right, page 37. All right, what did I write down here? Literature versus horror, the horror of reality. What does that mean, Maryse? Not having the same kind of gravity, not being part of the average. Is it comedy or tragedy? Can genres be rewritten? Isn't literature somewhat misshapen compared to the news? Isn't a novel a kind of dwarf compared to a newspaper? And then farther down, books are so tiny compared to the horror. Literature in this country is only fit to decorate the garden. Again, like this thing about scale in the book, and about the handwriting being really small, and this dwarf that the narrator sees and admires so sweetly. And then I love this thing about like the horror of the news, and like the sort of impotence of literature to accurately, you know, fight it or represent it even. But then what? Literature in this country is only fit to decorate the garden. But then, of course, the book insists on the garden and the beauty of the garden. So, yeah. So I think about this all the time, about horror and literature, and often my work is, for whatever reason, described as horrific, which I don't think it's that way. But what can books do?
Well, it's amazing and a huge question at the same time. No? It's amazing, but also it's so huge. I don't know. I would love to hear also what you have to say about this. And here, writing, well, I'm sure you know about this, but well, in Mexico, every day 11 women are killed daily just because being born women, you know. Femicides here are terrible. It's a very violent country, and you know, it's only the tip of the iceberg, like all this violence, but there's many violence, like also, and there are many levels in that violence. And of course, in language, you know, like going to school, walking around the streets, and so you can see that everywhere. So it is a big question also, no? Like, what do you do in a country where 11 women are killed daily? Like, what is writing relate to that, no? Or how writing relates to that? What can you do? Like, is there something in the arts you can really do with your context, no? So I think the scale problem, it's amazing. I think one of the first books I read was Alice in Wonderland, of course, which I think it's the book of scales, and it's amazing how it all happens, and the relation between the girl with the huge spaces or the super uncomfortable spaces when she grows like a giant. And it also, I think it also relates to us in many other ways, no? So what I was thinking when I was doing when I was doing Loop was mainly that, no? The problem of scales in reality, the arts, and how do we relate to those realities, and how do we relate to the newspaper, no? Like, I don't know if that makes sense, but
oh yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that's the big question all the time, is why spend time doing this, which is something you do usually by yourself in a room when all this other stuff is going on. And I mean, I think repetition and I mean the notion of the line itself not being from here to there, right? And your whole thing about capitalism, like, it's not that art needs to destroy the evil in the world.
Yeah, exactly.
Which it cannot do. So it can't be productive in that sense, but it can reflect, and it can insist on the perspective of the person writing it. And I think if you have an ethical aim in mind, which I think this book definitely does, and you know, one can only hope that most authors have some sense of a kind of ethics in their writing, which is also, for some reason, we're not supposed to talk about that when we talk about, I mean, so many writers and artists are like, oh, you know, the artist is amoral, which I think is ridiculous. But anyway,
or apolitical, no? Also, which is also something like, come on, how can you do that?
Yeah. So even you writing and pointing out these things about violence, and it is threaded through, very consciously throughout the text in a way that I think, because it's not posed as the center of it, but merely one of, many things that present the background and the foreground of the text, is that way of of circling it, right? And it's not like, here's my answer and here's my argument about what we do about it, but it's just a representation and saying, like, I'm a person in space and time, I'm presenting a small life, and the violence engulfs that small life, is the terrible thing that's like always not just at the margins but also in the center. And it's enough just to let the story, I think, exist within that context, and to always remind yourself and the reader that context is there, whatever context is important to us politically, emotionally. And if that's honest, like, that is enough, because it's, writing and reading aren't the only things that we do. And so sometimes we think again about art being this singular thing,
Yeah.
then of course we can't argue for it, you know, as enough, or as enough like activism, or as enough of an action, but it's not. So when I always find that when I get worked up about like, well, I'm just wasting my life, like not being a good person by like liking books and writing so much, I remind myself, well, it's only one of the many ways that I am in the world. And as long as I'm truthful to my context and the things that I care about, and the people and the things that I care about, then that should be enough to draw the circle around it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with all what you said, and the only thing I could add to what you just brilliantly said would be like, you know, like a tongue, like an emoji or a sticker, a puppy sticker.
You already, this is your response, right? That's your thumbs up. Let's follow Jeremy. Hello, Jeremy.
Hi, Jimmy.
Also a writer, runs a brilliant radio show on I-94, writing and books, and just
how cool,
marvelous human being here in Chicago.
Hi, Jimmy. I hope we meet next time I go to Chicago.
Yeah, you should be on their show. It's so fun. All right, 55. I underlined, I love this. Feeling misunderstood seems to make him a different size. I love that. So beautiful. And what else I underlined? A garden full of trees. That was the locus aminus in medieval times. My locus aminus is this notebook. It's where I play the guitar, where I feel sad, where I'm horribly sentimental. Oh, my little notebook. That was a bush in a past life. You guys, it's so good. I also want to talk about music, partly because Exile and Bookville as a bookstore is, the name comes from an album by Liz Phair, and they're going to be selling music there. So music is an important part of the store's way of being. In this book, for those who haven't read it, there's lots of, it is a song itself, and there's much music in it. And I thought a lot about how, as writers and just as human beings, it's so important to take from other forms of art and other narratives and to point them out, like in the text, as we've talked before. So much of it is about other writers, other books, friends, and these other influences, and the way that the book talks a lot about metamorphosis and the writer wanting to be a swallow, and that almost like the book itself isn't enough. Like we also want our books to be songs, and we want them to be films, and we want them to be paintings. And that's another thing I love about writing, is like trying to figure out how to replicate an effect from other forms of art that I love but can't make into a book. And that maybe that's partly what books and the notebook is like collecting all of those influences and then using words to try to imitate them in some ways, but not just to imitate, but to transform.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah.
Oh my God, the time is running out, but we still have 15 minutes. Peter says, Adam got to name all of the animals. Eve had to stay silent while God watched approvingly. Yeah, Adam. You hogged all the naming. I want to get a couple more of these book numbers in, and then if people want to ask a question that's not a number, you may do so now. So we have about 10 more minutes. Let's go to page 93 from Paul. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Paul.
I don't know if you can see things, but
no, I'm in my phone, so I can't really.
I'll read it I marked this one especially with my stars of delight. Again, scale, dwarf things, small things, little things in relation to the norm, insignificant things, things with different dimensions. Curiously, the stories I like the most are made up of trivialities, details, trifles. These days, people look at what's big, the big picture, big sales figure, success, bright lights, interviews, breaking news, whatever's famous, importance judged by fame. Maybe small things are subversive, living on a modest scale compared to the norm. Maybe the dwarf is the hero of our time. It's so good. I wish I had written that, but I'm glad you did. I got to read it. Maybe small things are subversive. I just think, like, I underlined that, and my little star was there to say, I think that's just like my motto as a writer. Like, I always feel that I can't, I used to worry when I was younger that my imagination was really small and that I couldn't write stories that were really, and like, like I couldn't think of like a big story with an intricate plot and all these characters, and I just couldn't do it. And the only thing I could do was just watch people do stuff and then try to accurately describe their gestures. And I feel like that's the only thing that I know how to do, and I always worried that it made me not a good enough writer. And interestingly, when I was younger, I thought that made me too feminine of a writer. I always thought like the highest compliment for someone to say she writes like a man or something. I remember thinking that when I was like 10, 12 years old, and then only later did I realize, like, no, it's not a deficiency not to be able to think on this grand scale in terms of writing, that like dwarf is the king, like the small things, like that's where the world is. And what resonates with me when I look at art or I watch a film or I listen to a song is like always the piece, right? It's like that little, not really the whole, but it's the part of it that like catches you and makes you want to take that little part and go home and make something out of it that's yours, but that also reflects the legacy of the inspiration. But this figure of the dwarf, where did this idea come from? Or is this dwarf a real person?
Just love what you say. There's thunders here and the dog is super crazy, running all over the place. Sorry. I love what you said, what you just said. And I think it's also exactly how I felt. So you grew up in the States. I grew up in Mexico City, and I felt exactly the same.
Wow.
Oh, sorry. Hello. I felt exactly the same. Like, growing up in.
I love it.
Like growing up here, the idea of being a writer when I was a kid, it was seeing Octavio Paz, the Nobel Prize poet, like in the cover of the newspaper, holding hands with Fidel Castro. Or it was Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and, holding hands with the president of France, and all these like big superstars, Latin American superstars. They were, of course, all male writers, and they were writing these super epic books, that explained what Latin America was or is or whatever. I think, well, very, I think I would go somewhere else and making like piñatas of Octavio Paz, I would just like hit the figure for the candies, because but anyway, I think like growing up with those epic stories and these huge like writers, and me, there were no books in my house basically, and I didn't grow up in a family, that loved the arts or whatever, nothing like that. So, I just went to school, whatever, and like the idea of me as a young or as a kid growing up in this country, and I could never picture myself, like I liked to read. I didn't know I liked to write or whatever. I didn't discover that yet until I fell in love in, you know, high school, and I wrote a terrible poem to a guy that of course didn't, we nothing happened. It was all a failure, starting with a poem. And so, well, yeah, like the idea of being an artist, it was just impossible, no? Like being a girl, in the context where all artists were male and very dominant and very famous, and, you know, telling all these huge stories, and you can see them also, you know, interviews in the news, like daily and everywhere. And well, so growing up there also made me think that my life was very little, and I had really nothing to say, because those things were for greater stories, for ambassadors, or I don't know, you know, this glamorous sort of 70s lifestyle, or that all those writers had. So I don't know, there was something that looked impossible, and I never thought about being a writer when I was a kid. There was no way, like there was no one to look up for, you know. No one, really no one. So because when you're 8 years old, you're not into, you know, reading women or whatever, like what you see in newspapers and pop culture and television and everything. Like the idea of the artist is basically male, no? So yeah, I think that what is very interesting, I think, about the idea of scales is how we relate to that, even though we're in the same scale, or the 1-1 scale, you know, like there are many systematic things, and of course, you know, patriarchy or capitalism or classism or racism, for example. It's a good example also of a problem of scale, no? How can that be possible, no? How someone is bigger, or, you know, than someone else, or why? Because scale, of course, has to do a lot with power too, no? Like who's bigger, who's smaller, who has less, like all those words that, like all those two groups of words, like the small and the big ones, have to do a lot with power today, no? It's like a small business, no? What's a small business, no? It's not Nike, of course, but what is small business? Come on, you know, like, I mean, it's a question of scales, no? And power, of course, and how we relate to those structures, and where are we in those structures. And sometimes the problem of scale comes just because you're being born something, no?
What changed for you when you realized, like, you know, did you encounter an artist that made you think, oh, I can be that, or that could be me? I mean, you mentioned two writers that did that for me, Robert Walser and
Pessoa. I love Pessoa.
It's so great, right? Like both of them. I mean, this book, for people who don't know, the Book of Disquiet, you know, every edition is different because all of the pieces are they're not in order. And so I remember my twin and I collecting the different volumes, and I just loved it. I mean, to me, it was fascinating. Like, oh, you don't have to see everything and like build this big, like the pieces, and then the flexibility of that interchange, and the necessity that you have an editor to make that decision. Like that like blew my mind that was even possible. And then reading Robert Walser, who, you know, is now very popular, but you know, at the time when I read him, I just never, I mean, there's like stories about ladies' gloves, and just talk about like how pretty the gloves are, and he wants to like kiss his hand, and I was like, that's a story, like okay, or like, you know, here's a pumpkin,
yeah,
whatever. I mean, And his handwriting, that tiny handwriting was so small too. So interesting to think about. Scale. Susan Baranowski just came out with a biography of Walser that I'm really interested in digging into. But I mean, it's interesting that those are male writers, but I think the fact that they were male and that they were doing something that I just didn't think like a person could do, I felt in a way that like these are very feminine writers, and like they're men that I can relate to as an artist. And then I read Joyce Carol Oates, and that was like a huge thing for me, where I was like, oh yeah, like women are like, yes, I can do that too. But those were some examples for me about how the small could work, and that really resonated. And I was curious about what were the things for you, and it doesn't have to be, I guess, writing, any kind of art that made you think, oh, I can be that. I don't have to be Octavio Paz.
Well, there are many things now also, and I'm very curious, and I love to see everything I can, and I'm interested in the arts and movies and other languages also, like reading books in translation, and so I think it comes from many different parts now, even music. For example, I don't really like Björk nowadays, but I definitely liked one of her albums, and I thought it was amazing, like to see a female singer in the 90s, at the end of the 90s or early 2000s or whatever, that didn't, just like be super sexual or very, sexy or whatever that means. And she didn't really sing this like girly stuff. And I don't know how to explain this, but she was not the traditional pop singer, that we're more used to. And I have nothing against Beyonce, for example, or nothing against Shakira. I actually love their work, and I've danced and sing many of their songs. So it's nothing against that, but in the same world, like I think someone like Björk was very important, and in that, from that perspective, also. I mean, putting the music apart, or like talking about like what she mean or what she meant in the pop culture, I think that has to do with that also, no? Like, okay, so I can be sort of weird, or I can, like something different, or it's not a love song, no? There was a song called something like The War of Me or something like that. Me and the war, or my war inside or something. So I think those kind of things like also have to do with, you being a teenager and then thinking like, oh wait, so perhaps there's something there, no? And also happening, well, for me, I think it came more earlier from the pop culture, or like things around me, or in the arts perhaps, or the movies, or music, than literature. Actually, I've been reading like women, well, not like women, sorry for that. I've been reading women mostly like in a more disciplined way, or whatever, with more, I'm looking more to what women are writing now than I did when I was in my 20s, So I'm trying to fill in like many of the gaps, because I study literature and I love reading, of course, as you do, and we share that. I love to read what my friends are doing, and not only my friends, of course. Like I love to know what's happening and what happened, and like why do we think Cervantes was the first one to write a novel if a woman wrote the first novel in the 10th century in Japan, because like the Tale of Genji is the first novel in history, and it was written by a woman, and it was written in Japanese, which is was a very lower slang form of telling a story. Chinese was, of course, the imperialistic and the official way of telling stories. But anyway, it was a woman, so Cervantes was the next one 5 centuries after. So okay, she was the first writer, the first one who wrote a novel. So I don't know, there are many gaps there. Like, what were female Latin American women were writing in the 20th century when all these superstars were also performing? Like our favorite shaman of Catherine Lacey is still there. I'm sure she will also share this. Clarice Lispector is a Carl Sagan to the universe, no?
Mm-hmm.
Like I've been thinking about one of her short stories all this week. I think, I don't know why Octavio Paz or Carlos Fuentes had all the spotlights and all the flashes and all the Nobel Prizes. I mean, Clarice Lispector it's Jesus. I mean, she's a shaman, no? She's a Carl Sagan, totally. Like, she shows you the rules of the universe, like how this works, and it's amazing. I mean, I'm short of words, and even in Spanish. Yeah, I think there are many female writers now that I got there, I would say late. I would have loved to grow up as a teenager reading Clarice Lispector, no? Yeah. And there's lots of them, no? I wouldn't like to name drop just blah blah blah, but there's of course a lot of amazing female writers in Latin America in the 20th century that did not have the spotlights and the flashes that the big ones had. So I think there's a lot there also. So, but I came to that late, I have to say. I think it was something more in the context or whatever. How was it for you?
It's the same for me. I think, yeah, I mean, it's interesting talking about the female influences more from other forms of art. Like Tori Amos musically was huge for me. For the woman singing about rape. I was like, please tell me more. And Tilda Swinton as just an image of a person who's an alien, and David, that feminine David Bowie thing that she has going on, still such an icon for me of wow, it's possible to be this other thing. I don't know, that's so feminine in some way, but then otherworldly. But it's true for me, I think, other than the popular culture books I was reading. Kathy Koja was a horror writer, still a big influence on me, and now a good friend of mine. I read Anne Rice, vampires, okay, but then I think it was only. What's that?
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. I love Interview with a Vampire.
Yeah, and I think, there was a lot going on there, but it wasn't until I read Joyce Carol Oates, I think, in high school, that I was oh, there is this other tradition of women who are taken seriously, but that somehow even someone as famous as her was not nearly as famous as Norman Mailer, or something like that. And I still feel someone like her is hidden weirdly, even as she's this huge person, but nobody my age ever talks about her as an influence, or even though she was doing all of this very feminist and avant-garde stuff 50 years ago. And yet we don't she's not really part of, I think, the education of writers. And there's so many, it's when you're saying about Clarice Lispector, but now it's different. Now I feel gosh, there are more women than we really could count, that people are talking about and reading and publishing. And so not least of all you, via Charcoal Press. So yeah, I agree. I wish I had grown up now and had these other ideas, but then, you know, you grow up as you do and you become the person you are, and it's good enough. But it's like what you're saying is about scale. Sometimes you have to look like in the cracks and at the margins, and that's where a lot of the good stuff is. And if the way there is like through and rice, like, okay, it's good enough. All right, we're a little bit over time, but there's 2 questions here, and one from Peter. He says, a quick question going back to the start of the conversation. Do you think that the third person point of view in fiction could ever be anything other than patriarchal? Anything other than dad watching everything and telling us what he wants to tell us about it? Even saying a goddess eye view of everything sounds a little strange, since one imagines that the goddess doesn't really want to be watching and thus controlling everyone in a little omniscient narrator's panopticon. As female feminist writers, do you ever feel limited by the choice of voices? What is a beautiful question. Could there be a feminist writing alternative to having to choose first, second, or third? Something even better than first person plural narrating from the we perspective? That's a great question.
Yeah, wow. So who did this question? What's his name?
Peter. Yeah.
Peter.
Good job.
Oh, wow. Hi, Peter. Yeah, well, wow. I mean, of course, I would like, the quickest answer I can think of would be, of course, there's a third person in a not patriarchal way of, being. Of course. The thing is, I was talking more about how the third person was mainly like, I was thinking more in examples of, there are many examples in the whole history, in the whole tradition. But I was thinking very specific examples in the 19th century, like when the novel, as you know, they were publishing novels in newspapers, and they were more popular and they were more accessible, and some of the great classical novels were published back then. And I think it has to do a lot with the construction of the third person. But it, of course, it's a very interesting question, of course. And sorry if I sounded like impulsively saying all the third persons, are machos, and no, I didn't really wanted to say that. But of course, I think there's an aspect, even though, for example, the medieval poetry, like all the beautiful epical poems from the Middle Ages or the medieval.
Oh, Brenda, I don't know if the storm got her. Doesn't seem like a little bit, it's pretty witchy. Like, then you have the black witch and the white witch, and then there's a storm behind Brenda, and like the dogs are barking, and then the lights cut out behind her at one point. She seemed unaware. Hopefully she'll come back, but I will add my 2 cents into this question. Peter, I think about this all the time, about perspective and how like things are limited, our choices are limited as writers, and sometimes none of the options really seem to fit, like, that there's some like other option waiting out there to be discovered. But I've always had a hard time writing in the first person, because I feel like the first person is so close to the assumption that the I is the author, and the first person seems so limited to me, because then you can only, I don't know, I feel like I'm writing as like the voyeur, like I'm watching, and that's my attitude towards the text, since I don't write from my life, and I don't write about things that I've seen or people that I know. And so all I can do is just like look through the peephole and like stare at these humans doing things. And so I often rely on the third person present tense to, like, I don't know, form the basis of that kind of distance, I guess, that I feel as a writer, which feels like an androgynous space. I mean, I guess it doesn't feel like, it certainly doesn't feel feminine at all. Maybe it feels more masculine. I don't know. This is a really interesting question, but I think it's true that the way that the different perspectives have been used and that they're talked about in criticism and in literary history feel like a prison in some ways that I don't know how to get out of. And especially writing this last book, which is almost all, I think it's all third person. And then it's all about men. So I don't know, that's kind of interesting, isn't it? I don't know. I love this question though. I'm gonna keep thinking about it. And next, Barry Paul Clark is a great musician and a composer. You should go look his stuff up after this. He says, great conversation this evening. I have a question about creating in capitalism. Don't we all have questions about that? I agree so much with Brenda about how as creators inside of capitalism, we often are forced to try to see our creativity as a resulting product. I try so hard to combat this in my creative work, but often get caught in that mental snare. Is there anything you do to combat this to help your creative practice? I wish Brenda was here to answer this question because I would love to hear her answer. But for me personally, I don't know. I hate to be a broken record about the twin, but I would say I always feel like there's an audience. The best audience is her, and the twinship exists outside of capitalism. So I don't know, but I do get caught up sometimes in the, all right, because you know you're already a part of an institution that's enmeshed with capitalism when you decide to publish through a press, and so the concerns and the interests of the institution necessarily become your interests and concerns. And I notice at the points when I start worrying about sales and I start worrying about reviews and all of those other things, it never makes me feel good. It makes me feel bad. It makes me not like what I do. It makes me not like myself. And so I guess the only practice I have to combat that is to identify that feeling of discomfort and dislike and immediately try to withdraw from whatever the concern is, I guess, about engaging with the institutions, and just remind myself to work in the best interest of the writing and myself / the twinship, which is just focus on like the joy of creating something, and the assumption that there is an audience for what you do, no matter where it is and through what channels it reaches that audience, even if it's, you know, your dog or your best friend on your couch listening to your record. Capitalism makes us think that we have to infinitely like recreate that one instance of a connection between a person and an audience, and you don't need to do that. Like there's no number that you reach where you say that's a big enough audience, that's a big enough, like my career has started because I have this many followers or whatever. Like as soon as you speak, we don't speak in a vacuum. Even if you're in a room by yourself, the walls are there, the bugs are there, right? Like nature's there. Anything that's produced is performed. Anything that is produced is heard. And everything else on top of that, the institutions would like you to think is just a repetition of that experience, that one experience of the first utterance. And so I don't have a good like succinct answer to that, but I guess that's how I pacify myself when I get worried about such questions. All right. Well, I don't know. Brenda is gone forever, which is a tragedy. But it was so much.
She's having trouble getting back in, unfortunately.
Well, it was amazing to have her. Well, we did.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone,
that was fantastic. I've never done an outro without our guests. This is kind of weird.
It feels really it feels empty.
It does feel weird.
I don't like it.
I'm trying to like delay, maybe she can get on, but I think she's having some serious problems. But thank everyone for tuning in tonight. That was such a great conversation. And Maryse, as always, you come prepared and make it less of a Zoom thing and more of a community-based, just a great conversation. And you're really passionate about how you present yourself and how you present the work. We all see it in a different light. So thank you so much for doing that. We love to have you on all the time. But if you haven't yet, gotta go this way. Right here, we have copies on hand. You can email us, call us. I'd say text us, but I don't want to give my number out. But make sure you get a copy. We'll certainly have copies in stock at our new physical space at Exile in Bookville. So thanks everyone for coming out. And Maryse, we can just hang out for a little after.
Yeah.
After everyone. Thanks everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.